To the Daily Objective, day 121 of the war in Israel.
Daniel, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. Are we still live?
yep.
Okay. Well, welcome to the Daily Objective, everyone. I'm sorry that about the technical issue. It looks like Razi's just cut out. We're on day 121 of the war. And the topic we're going to be talking about today is the reaction to UNRWA, because we've been focusing a lot about UNRWA recently on the channel. And so we're going to be focusing on that and also some of the reaction that we're seeing from within Israel. Hey, Razi.
Hey, yeah, my laptop decided now is the time to shut down, which means I missed the last few seconds, and I don't know how much of the story you told, but also I can't read it myself because it was on my laptop.
No worries.
Yeah,
I basically just said that we're going to be talking a bit about UNRWA and the reaction that we've seen and reported in the New York Times about within Israel itself. That's basically all I'd said.
yeah. So I wanted to give a little bit of background on what the story was, and I will. I was going to read it out, but I will read it out from memory. So there was a meeting between the head of UNRWA and the person in the Israeli Foreign Office that is in charge of the relationship with the UN, and it was some sort of a routine meeting, but it was yeah. At some point, the Israeli official said, "Look, we have information about UNRWA people who were involved in October 7th and that were involved in the kidnapping." And yeah, so the head of UNRWA went to New York, spoke to the head of the UN. They started talking about it. They fired some people, and then it was revealed somehow to the US. And Israel was not prepared for this. And basically, this became a bit of a it became what it is now. Now, the issue in Israel with that is they didn't want that to happen because they have this idea that we shouldn't completely destroy UNRWA because what if something worse comes along? And for as far back as I can remember, this was what people in Israel said about Yasser Arafat. This is why we shouldn't kill him. This is what people have said about Hamas for the past 20 years or so. We shouldn't completely defeat them. We shouldn't, every time there was a military operation in Gaza, the goal was never the elimination of Hamas. So yeah, Israel is clearly not learning from the lessons of its own policies and following them, unfortunately, and we know how that ends.
Yeah, and I guess well, just before we go into some of the things I was wondering about, is there a what do you view as some of the root of that then? Is there a kind of is it a philosophical problem? Is there almost like a self-esteem problem in Israel with how people are react? Because well, I guess I'll say part of what I was going to react is that it's a strange reaction in a way because this is an enemy in the clear light of day right in front of you, and in a sense, something which has been needing to happen for decades has happened, which is that people have seen UNRWA for what it really is and for how it's not an agency of peace, it's an agency in effect of the continuation of war. And so then to have that enemy on its knees about to be defeated by the end of the month and to then be kind of umming and ahhing and pulling back, there's something really strange in that about that reaction. And so is that and you basically kind of are saying that that's typical of the Israeli response because that's how they reacted to Yasser Arafat. So where is this coming from?
Yeah, it's not just typical of. I mean, it's consistent, completely consistent with Israel's response every single time, including after October 7th. We've talked about how after October 7th, there are daily attacks from the north. There are almost daily attacks or daily attempts at attacks from the West Bank, and Israel doesn't really act. It acts in this pinpoint responses that they did against Hamas until October 7th. So they are repeating exactly the same things that they were doing in the past. Where it comes from, uh, I don't know, because there's only the benefit of the doubt implies that there is some doubt that the person doesn't know what the result of their actions is going to be. There can be no doubt at this point, certainly with Israel's leader Netanyahu, who actually wrote a book explaining why his current policies are the worst thing that you can do against terrorism. Yeah, I don't know. As a human being, Netanyahu, as far as I'm concerned, is written off certainly as a leader.
For sure. And I guess something else I'll say just about this article reporting on it. I'm not a regular reader of the New York Times, but and I can see why. I'm not a regular reader. Not only just because of their typical editorial line, which I think I can get that kind of view from other British newspapers, which are a bit better, and also I kind of don't like them for people like Walter Duranty and all this kind of stuff. But the language throughout the article was basically persistently shifting blame and kind of suspicion upon Israel. So the language was kind of suggesting that the Israeli military was making the allegations against the UNRWA employees very cynically, and that it was coming in retaliation for the court case in the International Court of Justice, because apparently some of the lawyers on the South African side have referenced information from UNRWA. And so that is basically suggesting that Netanyahu saw that the International Court of Justice was doing this and then found some information, or perhaps even fudged it, in order to get some revenge. Whereas actually this information has been coming out against UNRWA for a long time and should have been as impactful as it has been much sooner. That was something that Eitan Fischberger, when we interviewed him the other day, was very eloquent on that point. This is something which has been a long time coming, and for the New York Times to be casting aspersions on Israel's motivations here, that their motivations are anything other than ordinary kind of self-defense against an organization which is supposed to be on their side and yet which is actually undermining them, is just extraordinary. So the whole language of the article was infuriating, and people are going to get bored of me making this allegation, but there is, I have to say, something so anti-Semitic about the continual suggestion that Israel is kind of scheming, rubbing its hands, plotting to do things on bad faith. Whereas actually we don't see any evidence of that at all. And in some way, when people talk about Israel, they just seem to not be able to keep these tropes from leaping out of their mouths. It really is quite extraordinary. Did you find the article frustrating in that same way, Razi?
Yes, although it's more of the same. I mean, it's always frustrating to see how Israel responds to the threats against it in the face of evidence that this is a disastrous policy. I saw somewhere also that there was something by Netanyahu. Netanyahu was reported to have said that we should get rid of UNRWA and we should replace it with a different UN agency. So I don't know. I'm at a loss. Like, I don't know how you can look at what is it going to be replaced by? Is it going to be replaced by something like the idea that Netanyahu, by the way, previously was reported to have had for what will happen in Gaza after the war, which is that some armed families will be in charge of security in Gaza. Those armed families are already there and they're already armed, and they were armed under Hamas. So what does that mean? That's white labeling, as it's called, when we mentioned that last time. So yeah, I think wherever Israel has enemies, Israeli leadership will convince itself and try to convince the people why it's good to keep those enemies around, because maybe there are worse enemies just around the corner. By the way, Morgan, since my laptop died, I'm unable to read any comments in the chat, so that is on you or on Daniel to send you.
No, for sure. I've got a couple of super chats which we'll get to, but Daniel, if there's any insightful comments that people are making, you can send them my way and we can discuss them a little bit. Yeah, I agree that there's the idea that Israel thinks that they shouldn't oppose, or they shouldn't actually get rid of UNRWA for fear that something worse will replace it. I think, I'll explicate that a bit more, I guess, but I think at the root of it has to be, I guess, a problem with principled thinking. I think that's maybe what the issue is, because the kind of reasoning, I guess, is this, it's the same kind of thing. And, I guess I'm going to ridicule it here, that you see in kind of police crime shows, if that makes sense. So I recently rewatched the series Life on Mars, which is a British crime police drama that's set in the 70s, right? And the lead police officer is really corrupt, and he just goes with his gut kind of thing. And so when it comes to gangsters, he takes bribes from the gangsters, and the modern police officer who's been transported back in time is shocked by this. Is that, and how could you do this? He says, well, because if these guys actually keep the worst elements under wraps, and actually if he weren't there, he would be replaced by something much worse. And it's the same kind of reasoning, in effect, that Israel's making. And yet, the TV show is quite eloquent on this point, in that actually this just leads to the further corruption of the city that he's trying to protect, and he's selling his own integrity down the river. And it actually leads to the situation being much worse. And so the Israeli military's reasoning seems to be the same, that they need to keep this corrupt organization around, even though they know it's acting against Israel's interests, just in case something worse replaces it. And maybe actually that's also just kind of arbitrary speculation. Maybe they have information which we don't about who would maybe spring up in its place. But the reason, and the only worst organization that I could see springing up in its place would be something led by Israel's Arab neighbors. If in effect there was a new agency to be set up that was being led by Jordan or something like that, maybe that would be worse. But the problem with UNRWA was that it, in effect, was being run on the ground by members of Hamas, or by the most extreme elements. So the idea that they were just kind of being run by the United Nations isn't really true. This was just ultimately a proxy certainly in the education, and it would have been in the schools as well. So do you think there's something in that it's a problem with principled thinking, with thinking in the long term?
I mean, it was run by the United Nations. The fact that on the ground it was run by terrorists is not something that is news to anybody in the United Nations. They knew all along what it was that they were, that was being done in their name, and it was a cash cow, and it still is. I mean, the temporary pause in funding so that a few people can be fired is not the end of UNRWA. And again, as we hear, if it is the end of UNRWA, it'll be UNRWA but with a different name, and the exact same organization. So yeah, I mean, again, like, what October 7th should have been in terms of what Israel's response should have been militarily is Gaza being a completely different place immediately. The fact that 4 months later we're still talking about when, is the ceasefire imminent and what is Israel gonna agree to have instead, shows how Israel is treating the enemy that said it did the attack. So anything that has plausible deniability, supposedly like UNRWA, although I don't know how they would have that. Israel will let them get away with it, and will make a little bit of noise. And the U.S. is making a little bit of noise, and a few other countries are doing what they're doing with pausing the funding. But no, the idea that anything fundamental will change, I'll believe that something fundamental will change when we hear more people talk like the Czech defense minister talked a few months ago, when she said that the UN, not UNRWA, the UN supports terrorists, and the Czech Republic has no place in such an organization. When I hear that from the US and from Israel, then I'll believe that there's an opportunity for change, because it does have to come from the leadership, and and not from us talking here on the channel. Although again, if we talk here on the channel and the leadership listens, maybe that'll help. But no, and by the way, whoever is hoping for an alternative, Trump is already. I don't know if you heard it very recent, like last night. I think he said something about how Israel chickened out of the assassination of Soleimani. So he's already stated in several occasions where he stands on this, and we know where he stands on Ukraine. So yeah, the current U.S. administration is not doing what needs to be done. The only likely alternative to it will also not do what needs to be done. Will possibly be worse. And I think in Israel it's the same. I don't see an alternative that's going to say, look, this organization is corrupt. The UN as an organization is corrupt uh, in its essence, because its essence is all countries are equal, no matter who is leading them. This is like in any society, if you treat law-abiding citizens and criminal gangs as equal, because that is what dictatorships are. So yeah, that's my long rant about how everything is hopeless.
Well, I think it's a conclusion that's tough to avoid, given that we follow the news on Israel quite as closely as we do. We have to take in all the really bad evidence. So if people think that in the long term we should be optimistic, it's quite hard to think quite on that abstract a level sometimes when you're taking in the daily news, particularly the daily news from the New York Times. But you're right, though, and basically the point that you're making there was Ayn Rand's problem with the UN, and people, as always, though we try and do our best to vindicate Rand's perspective, she'll be much more eloquent on it than we are. So people should go check out what she had to say on the UN. I can't remember exactly where she makes her comments on the UN. Perhaps it's actually in person in one of her interviews. But I think, the root of what you're saying as well, because I'm trying to locate what the philosophical problems are as best I can. And the other one, I guess, has to be altruism, that people are uncomfortable in some way with destroying UNRWA because UNRWA's ostensible aim is charitable. And this is something which, we're talking from the Israeli perspective, but certainly in the West, I've seen people lamenting very much the destruction of UNRWA because it is this charitable organization which people are claiming is indispensable to the humanitarian relief efforts on the ground to the extent that they're able to be done. And Eitan as well has one of the most interesting Twitter feeds at the moment. And he tweeted something out the other day, which was a document that was looking at how much aid is actually getting into the Gaza Strip from Egypt. Now, what was interesting about the New York Times article we were reading in preparation for this is that they refer to the aid as meager. But actually, this document that Eitan was tweeting out, if it was correct, I haven't verified it, was that the aid was actually not as bad as people were saying it was. And if it was so woefully insufficient, then the logical conclusion we have to assume is that it's being stolen by Hamas. And this further goes to the point that Hamas actually doesn't care about its own people, completely treats them as instrumental to its goals. And for people then to continue supporting UNRWA because it's charitable and we hold an altruistic standard, it is suicidal in the long run.
Yeah, it's suicidal and it's factually incorrect. UNRWA is not a charitable organization. It's not people contributing to it. It's taxpayers' money from different countries. So I'm not a supporter of UNRWA morally, but I am a supporter of UNRWA financially against my will. So that's not charity. Charity is when you actually choose to give to somebody, but it can be again, like the truth doesn't really matter certainly to the people who are on the anti-Israel side. It actually matters in the sense that it's something to be denied. So they can push it as a charitable organization. They can say that what was it about Hamas that you just mentioned?
That they're basically taking aid that's coming in that should be going to the people, right?
Yeah,
that's what
yeah. So which of course is ridiculous to claim that is the whole story, as opposed to Hamas being very much in control of UNRWA, and there's no need to steal. Maybe there's one place where UNRWA people aren't too happy with what's going on. I'm sure there are inner conflicts even within Hamas, but yeah, to treat these organizations, to not treat these organizations as one and the same, is a denial of the facts of reality as they were known before October 7th, and as they are like undeniably known at this point. So yeah. That is what we're dealing with.
For sure. And I guess, I'll give another plug to Eitan's Twitter feed because it is very good. He's doing the proper kind of boot and spade work that investigative journalists should be doing. And another thing he was tweeting out was looking at UNRWA's vetting processes for their members of staff and basically showing that they don't have them. And this was a document which is on the UNRWA website, which anyone can go look at, and which is a kind of questionnaire or a form, basically, which they give to people when they're applying to work at UNRWA. And it basically is telling them that, they need to be neutral. And it's in effect kind of like the documents which you sign when you come into an airport in the US, right? You basically sign the box that says, no, I'm not a terrorist. As if, what is the point of that? Is the terrorist ever going to say, oh, you caught me? Yes, I am. Please take me away. So these people, when it's talking about neutrality, it's basically the same kind of thing. It's saying, are you a member of a terrorist organization? And the person just says, no, I'm not. And it's like, oh, good. Well, in you come then. So there is no real vetting process at all to stop people from Hamas coming in, which is obviously, and these people are much more integrated into the population than people in the West would really like to admit. So
yeah, and again, there's no official vetting process on the part of on the part of the UN. There certainly is some unofficial vetting process on the part of Hamas. So the people who control things on the ground, without a doubt, they vet. They vet who is in. Who can be a part of UNRWA, at least to a large extent. So yeah, and again, I'm repeating myself, but this is not something that wasn't known. This is not something that wasn't known to people, people in UNRWA who are working in offices in New York or elsewhere. This is not something that was unknown to the leadership of the UN. This has always been the case. So now a little bit is being done, but let's not forget that if anybody accepts the existence of this organization as something legitimate, then they are somewhere on the spectrum of the wrong side.
yeah. And so, well, as you say, the problems with UNRWA have been known about for years, and perhaps they've been known more to people who are really kind of well, either in Israel, let's say, or if, in the West, someone who's slightly more geeky about this kind of information. Because I understand for most people, the idea that you're going to know a lot about one of these random wings of the UN is probably not very likely. It's probably not an area of the news you attend to very much and so on. So this information might seem like it's relatively new. But there's information like this, which has been coming out for a long time in Western news sources, and it's reaching a critical mass at the moment. But the fact that it might seem like it's being reported on more at the moment doesn't mean that this information doesn't go back a long way. Eitan, again, was mentioning in his initial interview with you, Razi, information, at least going back to 2004, about UNRWA bags containing ammunition and all this kind of stuff, right? And something, again, that was appalling about the New York Times article was it was kind of suggesting that Israel has had this long-term unwarranted bias against UNRWA, and now it's, they've managed to find something that they, look long enough and you'll find something. But the whole premise of UNRWA is something which is anti-Israeli. In effect, the whole way they define Palestinian refugees, to the point that there's, is it 6 million or something now? So many decades, and so this is refugees from the war of 1948. So many decades after it happened, someone like Edward Said, who was born in 1935 in Jerusalem, even though he emigrated to the UK and then to the US and had citizenship in other countries, was counted as, until the day he died in 2001, 2002, as a refugee, even though he'd no longer clearly earned that status. So the whole premise of UNRWA is anti-Israeli and is designed to continue the idea that Israel's whole existence is unjust. And you can see that whole attitude in UNRWA's spokespeople. This guy, Chris Gunners, who no longer works for them, but did until 2019, has come back out of the woodwork. He's a guy from the UK. And you can see from his whole perspective on the issue that it's not like he's neutral on this. It's not like that UNRWA employees are just coming from the perspective, we just want to help people. We don't want to take one side or the other. They're clearly leaning towards one side. But go on.
Yeah, and by the way, this is not something that's unique to UNRWA. Like UNRWA is this bad apple within the UN. Like you have, a multinational company and you have one person fudging the numbers or something, and like stealing from the company. This is what the UN is. I mean, if you look at UN agencies, this has always happened. There was child what was it, child molestation scandal in Africa by some UN agency. There was what was it, the oil for food program. There's if you want to get away with things that you can't get away with normally in normal society, the best place to go is get a job at the UN, and especially one of those UN agencies that are one step removed from the central office, because you will get to do whatever you want, and you have the immunity that comes with being the UN, and the moral immunity that comes with it. So yeah, this is why we've been talking about UNRWA a lot and being specific, but we should talk broadly and mention. And we've done that long before October 7th. We've called for free countries to leave the UN. The organization doesn't need to be abolished. North Korea and Iran and whoever else can continue. I mean, I wouldn't let Iran continue to exist as it is today, but all these, North Korea, China, Russia, can have their own Security Council where they decide who's allowed to defend itself. But we shouldn't be a part of it. And yeah, and also an organization, I think, of free countries would look differently and would be less well. We'll have to wait and see what that looks like. Anyway, we do have TRS Extra coming up soon. You mentioned there were some super chats. By the way, as I mentioned, can't see the chat at all.
Yes, sure. So we have $20 from Akira Felix, who says for Razi's new laptop fund. So there you go, Razi. You've got a little contribution towards that. And we have $1 from Bonnie. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And those are the ones we have.
Thanks. And yeah, I turned it on again and it turned off again. So I am a little bit worried about what this laptop is, what its condition is, but we will find that out in some future episode. All right, TRS Extra is starting in a couple of minutes. Morgan, what is the topic or topics for that?
We're talking about Joe Biden's sanctioning of forced settlers in the West Bank. So we're talking about that and its implications. Why is it happening now? It was done through an executive order. We're going to talk a bit about executive orders and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, and you are joined by Michael Leibowitz, Mark Pellegrino, and I might try to join somehow, but if I do, I'll be fashionably late. And but yeah, anybody, that is, by the way, that is for YouTube members. So you do need to become a member. You can click the join button on YouTube right now, and you will have access to that. If you are a member through the website and not through YouTube, you can also join the Zoom call for that. That doesn't mean you can participate. It means you can watch it on Zoom, and there's the Zoom chat, which is its own separate chat. Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We will be back with the Daily Objective tomorrow.
See you later.